Midnight, and you and I will be paying an astronomical 17 rands per litre for petrol. But what's driving the cost of our fuel, and why is it that countries like Botswana, for example, who get their fuel from South Africa, pay less for their fuel? To answer these questions, we have in the studio Robert Maake from the Department of Energy, economist Sam Rolland, and Layton Beard from the Automobile Association. Good evening to all of you gentlemen, and thanks very much for your time. I'm sure, Mr. Maake, you're probably tired of having to say this over and over again, but I'm going to ask you to say it again. Why are we paying so much for our fuel? And is it really, really beyond our control?
Thank you, Vuyo, and good evening to the viewers at home. The main drivers of our fuel price is the crude oil price as well as the exchange rate when it comes to the international factors. That's what changes on monthly basis. However, there are other factors that are adjusted on annual basis, like your industry margins, the wages that we adjusted last month for the forecourt attendance, and of course the fuel levy and the road accident funds are also adjusted once every year. So in this current fuel price adjustment, the main drivers were the weaker rand and the price of crude oil, which drove the price of petroleum product high in the international market.
Are we really as passive recipients as the government would like us to believe?
Yes and no. So firstly, as Robert said, government policy dictates how much the consumer pays that goes towards the road accident fund and goes into the fiscus, which ultimately helps pay for things like social grants, things like infrastructure investment. So that side is domestically determined. And when you think of that, you need to think of the political sphere. But when we think of the international markets, emerging markets have done very poorly over the past couple of months. And unfortunately, we are at the mercy of rand fluctuations and things like a stronger US dollar that ultimately pushes the oil price higher. Those kind of things we really can't do anything about. And as Robert mentioned, the levies are adjusted on an annual basis. So we can't just suddenly decide to take away the fuel levy or the levy for the road accident fund, because ultimately that's going to result in a shortfall in the fiscus, which we're going to have to pay for somewhere later down the line or somewhere else in our taxes.
So we're doomed, Layton.
Sure, strong language, Vuyo, but I think for a lot of consumers, that's exactly how they're going to feel, that they're at the mercy of this very weak rand, that economic growth is very difficult in this current environment, that the economy is going to struggle with a petrol price of around 17 rand a litre. I think there is a mood that people are very despondent, and they're looking for ways to get out of this, and they're looking, as you said in your intro there, are they going to have to cut back on certain things? So it's all about looking at your budget, what can I cut and where am I going to save? I think doomed is very strong, but I think there's a lot of despondency out there from a lot of people who are looking at this petrol price going, well, I actually don't know how I'm going to get to work tomorrow.
So you can't pull the trick you pulled the last time we had a petrol price, Robert?
Yeah, Vuyo, as you probably know, it was a once-off intervention by the Minister of Energy. And the reason the minister was able to intervene is because there was money in this late levy account that could be used for that particular intervention. Currently, there's no money in the account to do that. But beside that, Vuyo, there are other unintended consequences that we learned about afterwards. There are some companies that are importing fuel that are not on this late account. And it means whatever intervention was made last month, they are going to lose that money because they cannot recover it. And there are also LPG gas importers who are also not part of this late account, so they're also going to lose out on that intervention. That is the reason why the minister said it was only a once-off intervention, and that was it.
Are you saying you regret making that decision the last time?
No, we are not saying we regret, but we are saying because it was the first time and it has to be done, there are lessons that are learned from that. So the companies that are not there, like Puma Energy, for example, to mention a name, they'll then have to register to be part of this late account. Then they'll have to give us audited volumes and so on going forward.
What can we do, Sam?
Well, I mean, just
let's forget now about all these things that we're saying we can't change. The price, I mean, the rand-dollar exchange rate, and the price of crude oil.
Yeah.
But I mean, we obviously can't just sit idly or fold our arms and say, it is what it is.
Yeah.
There is. I mean, is there no room to think really hard about out of the box, as some people experts like to say, what can we really do? Because this is unsustainable.
Yeah, I mean, so there are a number of things, and ultimately, with any intervention, with any change in behavior, you have to realize, without growth in the economy, we're just going to be kicking the can down the road further. On a consumer level, and perhaps the other gentleman would like to elaborate, is things like changing your behavior, your driving behavior, changing your work behavior to, improve your own personal fuel efficiency. On a company-wide level, obviously we know that the fuel price impacts on food inflation tremendously, and this translates into higher food prices that's going to impact the poor most. Companies can decide to absorb a lot of that fuel increase, and that unfortunately decreases their margins. So if it's a short-term thing, this can possibly happen if we're going to see the rand strengthen again. And to go on to that, we're seeing the MTBPS coming out at the end of this month. We're seeing Moody's hold their rating decision just after that. If these two events are positively received, if the Minister Nene delivers a budget that's strong on policy certainty, you might see the rand recover, and a bit of sort of risk on appetite to the rand that strengthens the rand, and that offsets any sort of oil price increase that we might see.
But is the issue really political certainty?
In our current climate, and if you think back to March of last year when the previous president shuffled the cabinet and we saw a downgrade of a lot of our ratings, and the rand did take a huge knock. The international market is very jittery. They know that the government doesn't have a lot of room to maneuver, and the rating agencies, if Moody's were to downgrade us once again, we'd see a huge depreciation of the rand. And that's going to result in even higher fuel prices that we might have thought before. So, the market is jittery. We need to send the best signals we can just to think of the consumer really, and to think of how they're going to receive a petrol price increase when we think that the elections aren't too far away.
I mean, Layton, I'm sure, the AA has done comparative studies. You've looked at economies that are similar to ours, and notwithstanding what Sam was talking about, with regard to policy uncertainty. I mean, what do other people do when they find themselves in the same situation?
Well, a lot of countries in the same situation are facing the same sort of problems, because they're also having to pay higher fuel prices now than they were, for instance, 6 months ago. When we look at the world and what it costs for fuel throughout the world, South Africa's kind of sitting towards the middle of that chart. We're not paying the 29 rand a litre that, for instance, Norway or Sweden is paying, but we're also not paying, the 3 or 4 rand. And in your intro again, you mentioned Botswana, and the reason they pay less is because they obviously don't have this 5.30 rand, these levies on their fuel, which makes up about a third of the petrol price. So other economies are having to grapple with this issue as well. They're also struggling to find ways in which to deal with it. And I think, apropos your previous question, what can be done about it? I mean, maybe it is time now to have a look at this issue of, do we need to relook at how the petrol price is structured? Do we need to relook at how these levies are structured?
You mean revisit the levies?
Well, not revisit the levies, but revisit how the fuel price, the basic fuel price, is actually structured, how the fuel price beyond the levies is put together. In terms of the levies, and Sam mentioned this, you take the levies out of the equation, that's great, but then where's government going to get that money? I think what we've always said is, when those levies are increased on an annual basis, let's increase them in line with inflation, not higher, as has been the case in the past. Well, before I carry on, I just want to make one more point. We'll be talking a lot about the fuel price and how this is going to impact on consumers, and it is. But I think let's not lose sight of the fact that the poorest of the poor in this country have got to pay an extra 1.40 rand for illuminating paraffin. It's pushing the price of illuminating paraffin beyond 10.50 rand. These people use it for heating, for cooking, for lighting. Everything. these are the poorest of the poor. They've got to pay that. They've also got to pay the increased fuel prices. They've got to pay increases to VAT. These are the people that we really should be considering, because they are the ones that are going to struggle the most.
More concerned about, because there's even more than we have to endure. On the line, we have Jeffrey from Leondale. Good evening, Jeff.
Good evening.
Jeff,
Good
your
evening. How are
question,
you,
comment? We're well, thank you.
Yes, Vuyo.
Yes. What have you got to say?
Yes, Vuyo.
Yes. Your question or comment?
I've got a question here.
Yes.
They are twofold. One, why is that Sasol is locally produced fuel but is more equally priced to import? And therefore, the second question is, what was the possibility of establishing Sasol so that we can produce our own fuel?
Okay. Thanks, Jeff. Do you want to take that, Mr. Maake?
Yeah, we can take that, the issue around Sasol. I mean, firstly, we are in a regulated market, so Sasol had to sell at the regulated price. But the reality of Sasol is that when you talk of Sasol, you must talk of two Sasols, in my view. The Sasol Secunda that make fuel from coal, and the Sasol at Natrev that make fuel from crude oil as well. But Sasol supplies only a small percentage of the market. And if we were to deregulate the price, for example, Sasol cannot cope with the demand of the country. But also the refinery of Sasol, that plant of Sasol is very expensive than the normal oil refinery, because you have to burn your coal first, convert it to gas, and then you take the gas, convert to chemical products. That is why when Sasol wanted to build a similar plant in Limpopo, that project could not take off because of the cost. And now there's added cost of environmental costs in terms of CO2 emission and so on. So it's very expensive. But beside that, Vuyo, there's Sasol station in other provinces. Now, the fuel that you buy, for example, in Cape Town at a Sasol service station, does not necessarily come from the refinery in Secunda. It comes from a refinery in Cape Town. So the oil companies are involved in what is known as product swaps. So obviously, there's no way Sasol in Cape Town can sell at a lower price when they buy from a Chevron refinery, which sells at a normal price based on crude pricing. So those are some of the dynamics that we have in our economy, in our petroleum industry in particular.
Well, which takes us to his second question. What was the point of establishing Sasol in the first place? Was it not to deal with these very questions that we're confronted with right now?
Yeah, but remember, the situation at the time Sasol was established is different from what it is today. Sasol was established during the time of sanction against South Africa. And South Africa was more worried about self-sufficiency, producing your own fuel. That is why government could put money to build Sasol at the time, because we had to have our own locally produced fuel. But now the industry has grown. There's more demand for fuel. Sasol cannot cope with the demand. But also remember, Sasol now is a private company.
But we've inherited so many things from the apartheid government, truth be told, and we've had to make them work for a new South Africa, didn't we?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, the major oil producers like Saudi Arabia and the Middle Eastern countries can extract oil at a significantly lower price than we can refine it. And so in just a trade perspective, it doesn't make sense for us to produce our own at a much higher cost when we can import it, take away that whole value chain, and just do a small portion of the refining here. That ultimately leads to a lower cost to the consumer, not trying to produce everything ourselves. And that's, back then in the previous government, there was things like sanctions, trying to bust sanctions, trying to reduce the reliance on the global economy. Yeah. We can't do that anymore.
No. Okay. Let's take another call. Michael is from Benoni. Your question, comment, Michael?
Yes, good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, sir. Good evening.
Yes. What if in the difficult period, can we compensate by purchasing oil from the neighboring countries? That is where, fuel, from the neighboring countries where the fuel is cheaper. Like to remedy the situation only in difficult times.
Is that even a possibility?
I didn't understand.
Sorry, I didn't get the
Says,
question.
why don't we purchase petrol from neighboring countries? Won't that alleviate our situation?
I think Robert's the best place to
No,
answer that.
there's no neighboring countries that produce petroleum product. As you rightfully said in your intro, our neighboring countries, Botswana, Swaziland,
They're
Namibia,
buying it from us.
they all don't have refineries. They're buying from South African companies.
Yeah.
So that one is not an option. Unless if it's talking about crude oil from Nigeria, Angola, and so on. The reality of the matter is that oil companies are buying crude oil from there. But because they're also members of OPEC, it's priced at the international price.
I think then what causes this dissonance, even from people who can maybe understand where you're coming from or hearing your explanation, say, but if they are buying from us, why then is it cheaper for them? Maybe we need to then go back to the question of levies. What do these levies do that we can't really do without?
Look, I'm not from the National Treasury, but as my colleagues have said, the fuel levy goes into the national revenue pool. It becomes budget for the country. So when the Minister of Finance allocate budgets, there's part of the money that goes there. And then we have your road accident fund, which is ring-fenced to compensate for people who are involved in accident, and that is managed by Department of Transport.
So about 80 billion rand, I think in 2017, was gathered through the general fuel levy, and around 45 billion was gathered for the road accident fund levy. So you're looking at about 120 billion rand that was added to the fiscus. And I think, to your point, a lot of people look at these numbers and they look at, maybe this issue of good governance that is around government at the moment and say, well, are we getting value for the money that we're spending on that? And that is a debate that really, I think, needs to be held about whether, in the context of the good governance and the economic growth that we're trying to get in the country, whether the payment of these levies is actually still benefiting South Africans. But, as Sam also said earlier, if we take these levies out of the equation, government will still need that 120 billion, and it will still need to come from somewhere. And that may mean, do we put the VAT rate up to 25%, or do we increase personal income tax? Or will there be other indirect taxes to get this money? And I don't think that South Africans want that. What I think we need in terms of the fuel price at the moment is, let's have a look at the basic fuel price, how that's structured, and then let's revisit this issue of the fuel levies and see, is there anything we can do to deal with that as well?
Sam? Would there be catastrophe if we were to do without these levies?
Well, I mean, yeah, so the fuel levy, as they mentioned, is the fourth highest revenue source in our budget. You take it away, and if you think of the fuel levy, it's targeted for people who either have a car or make use of a car in the taxi to commute. Then you have something like VAT, which is on almost all goods. So do you raise VAT and you target an even greater population, not just those making use of motorized transport, you're targeting everyone who consumes food, clothing, all of those things. The other thing is, do you then take it to personal income tax? The consumer who's been paying tax, and we do have a small tax base that we draw from, is at a point where we started to see tax revenue decline. We're kind of on a turning point where you increase tax rates, it's not going to bring in more tax, it brings in less tax. So in a situation like this, then we need to start to think, and this is a political decision, is do we spend less? Do we forego national health insurance so that people have cheaper fuel prices? Do we forego free higher education, because the money that could go to that could be, the money that's required to fund free education could be taken away from the fuel levy, and that results in lower fuel prices. So it's a very difficult decision, and you can't just look at it in terms of we're paying higher fuel, because we pay higher fuel to fund grants, to fund higher education, to fund NHI. How do you do that? And that is decided on a much higher level, and it ultimately depends on the politics of the day.
At the lowest level, Layton, what does Koko Mkize do now? How do they cushion themselves, especially those like...
Yeah, it's a question we get asked almost every day. Unfortunately, there's not a one-size-fits-all solution, but obviously, some of the things that we say to people is make sure that you budget properly. So what you budgeted for in September and August will not be the same budget that's going to carry you through October. So you've got to budget accordingly. And that may mean that you're going to have to take away from some other things in your budget to fund this. If you do own a car, maybe you want to consider public transport if it is available and reliable and cheaper than what you're paying currently. Is your car in a good condition? Is it serviced and maintained? Because that's going to use the right amount of fuel as opposed to a car that isn't, that is going to require more. Can you carpool? Can you check different routes? Can you leave for work early in the morning to avoid the traffic jams? So these are some of the things that we would suggest to people. It's not going to work for everybody, but I think what it is going to do is it's going to focus people's attention on their petrol budget and make sure that they know what they're spending on that petrol every month and that they actually can see it through to the end of the month with the tank that they've got.
Very quick last word from you, Robert.
Yeah, from the department side, the minister has instructed us to review the pricing formula from the BFP until the pump price, which will be publishing the discussion document in the next few weeks. Parallel to that, we are looking at a more sustainable way of cushioning motorists. We have a smoothing fund that is at SAF. It has been inactive for quite a number of years. We are looking at resuscitating that smoothing fund. Now what we need to discuss is the mechanism, how to get the money flowing in and out of the fund.